He stood in the half-dark of his office, one hand pressed against the edge of his desk, breathing like a man trying not to fall apart. A broken porcelain cup lay on the floor beside him, its scattered pieces catching the glow of a lone desk lamp. Outside the glass walls, the building was silent, the city far below, settling into night, but inside that room, something had clearly come undone. Claire Foster didn't mean to witness any of it. She had only come to leave a file, only meant to knock and walk away, but the moment she heard something break, not loudly, but with the quiet finality of a person reaching their limit, she froze in the shadowed hallway, her fingers tightening around the folder she carried. It didn't make sense. Men like Mark Ellery weren't supposed to look shattered. Men with power, money, influence, men who commanded a room with a nod, they weren't supposed to tremble alone behind closed doors. Yet there he was, shoulders shaking in the dim light, as if grief had suddenly found its way back to him. And as Claire stood there, unsure whether to step forward or disappear, one question pressed itself into the stillness between them. What could break a man who seemed unbreakable? If you've ever seen someone strong reach their breaking point, this story may feel familiar. Let's begin. At 9:52 p.m., Claire Foster stood outside her boss's office, listening to something break on the other side of the door. The hallway on the 28th floor was dark, except for the soft glow spilling from the crack beneath his door. It stretched across the carpet like a thin ribbon of gold, trembling each time another object inside clattered against the floor. She held a manila folder to her chest, the edge pressing into her coat, while the rest of the building lay in that strange quiet only office towers had at night, emptiness humming behind every door. She hadn't meant to stay this late. 3 weeks into the job, she was still navigating the impossible pace of Ellery and Co., and it often meant sorting paperwork when the rest of the city had gone home. She had passed this hallway dozens of times after hours. It was always silent. Tonight it felt alive, charged with something raw and uncontrolled. She took one slow breath, lifted her hand, and knocked gently. For a moment, everything stopped inside the office, the scraping, the clatter, even the muted shuffle. Then footsteps approached the door. When it opened, she almost stepped back. Mark Ellery filled the doorway, but everything about him looked smaller somehow. His eyes were red-rimmed, not from drink, but from something deeper. His tie hung loose, his hair pushed back as though he'd dragged his hand through it too many times. He exhaled sharply, the kind of breath that came from someone trying very hard to keep himself together. Behind him, the warm desk lamp cast his shadow across the floor, the silhouette shaking slightly with each breath he took. What his voice was sharp, quicker than he intended. She flinched but didn't drop the folder. Up close, she could see the tension tightening the muscles around his jaw. Whatever had happened in that room hadn't been about anger at all. It was something heavier, something she recognized from nights when her father couldn't find the right words, when grief and fear tangled inside him until all he could do was lash out. "I'm sorry," she said softly. "You asked for these reports for tomorrow morning." She held out the folder, her fingers steady despite the instinct telling her she shouldn't be here, shouldn't be seeing this. She hated intruding on pain. She'd had too much of that at home, but she couldn't make herself turn away either. He stared at the folder as if trying to remember why he'd needed it. Then his gaze snapped to her face. "I said I didn't want interruptions," he barked. The words hit the air like something thrown. Claire swallowed, felt her shoulders tighten, but she didn't move. Not yet. For a heartbeat. Anger lived in his eyes, wild, uncontrolled, a mask for something else. Then her expression finally reached him. The way her eyebrows lifted just slightly. The way she didn't retreat, but didn't challenge him either. Something in his face faltered, as though he'd suddenly realized he wasn't yelling at the wall or the pile of broken glass behind him, but at an actual person, someone who didn't deserve the brunt of whatever storm he was weathering. His breath caught, not loud, not dramatic, just a quiet break in the armor. He looked away, pressing his hand briefly against the doorframe as if steadying himself. The edge of a shattered picture frame lay behind him, the glass glittering in the warm lamplight. Claire couldn't see the photo inside, but grief had a shape, and she recognized it in him instantly. "I'll leave these on your desk," she murmured. Her voice was calm, respectful, not afraid. She stepped past him slowly so he could stop her if he wanted to. But he didn't. The office smelled faintly of cedar and the sharper scent of something spilled, a paperweight perhaps, or a glass that had rolled off the desk. She set the folder down, careful not to disturb anything. Mark stayed near the door, shoulders tight, gaze somewhere near the floor. He didn't speak. She didn't ask. Some wounds didn't want questions. But she could feel the tension radiating off him, a silent plea or warning, she couldn't tell which. On her way out, she glanced once more at him, at the way his fingers curled against the frame of the door, as though gripping it kept him upright. For a moment she wondered what it would be like to carry pain like that alone. Then she realized she already knew. "Good night, Mr. Ellery," she said quietly. He lifted his eyes to hers. They looked tired. Not the fatigue of overwork, but the exhaustion of someone who had been fighting something unseen for too long. He didn't respond, not with words, but something flickered there, an apology, maybe, or a warning, or the last remnants of pride trying to hold their ground. As she walked down the hallway, the echo of her footsteps soft against the carpet, she felt a question rise in her chest, a question that stayed with her long after the elevator doors closed around her. What kind of life could shatter a man like Mark Ellery? And why was he fighting that battle alone in the dark on the drive home? Claire kept replaying his trembling hands. The road ahead blurred slightly under the cold glow of the street lamps, each one stretching across her windshield before slipping away into the darkness behind her. Her old Subaru rattled softly as it always did when the temperature dipped below 40 degrees, and a grocery bag kept sliding across the passenger seat, tapping the center console with each turn. She tightened her grip on the steering wheel, trying to focus on the road instead of that moment, his breath catching, his shadow shaking in the lamplight, the sharp inside of grief showing through the cracks. She didn't know Mark well. Not really. 3 weeks wasn't enough time to understand a man like him, but she knew the sound of someone breaking. It had its own kind of silence, one she had grown too familiar with over the past few years. She drove past the gas station where the clerk always waved, past the darkened strip mall where only the pharmacy sign flickered. The night felt heavier than usual, as if it were carrying something on its back too. By the time she turned into her neighborhood on the west side of town, her chest felt tight, not from fear but from the pressure of everything waiting inside that small house. She parked by the curb, the engine ticking as it cooled. The porch light she had set on a timer cast a tired yellow glow over the worn steps. It wasn't the home she'd once imagined, but it was what she could manage after the divorce and after her father's condition worsened. Inside, the living room greeted her with the low hum of the TV. Her father sat in his recliner, knees covered with the old quilt his late wife had sewn decades ago. His head tilted slightly forward, eyes half closed. For a hopeful second, she thought he was asleep, but when she set the grocery bag on the kitchen counter and returned to him, he looked up at her, confused, searching. "Hi, Dad," she said gently, kneeling beside the recliner. She brushed a strand of hair from her face and offered him a warm smile. He frowned, his eyebrows knitting together in a way that made him look both older and strangely childlike. "Emily." His voice was thin and uncertain. The name hit her like a cold wind. Emily had been her mother's name. She swallowed, her throat tightening. "No, Dad, it's Claire. I'm here." He blinked slowly, the recognition not fully reaching. She placed her hand over his, letting him hold on until the tremble in his fingers eased. Moments like these always took something out of her, something she didn't know how to replace. When the confusion softened in his eyes, he leaned back into the chair, tired again. "You were out late," he murmured. "Just work." She stood, smoothing her slacks, trying not to let the sting settle too deep. Long day. She moved through the kitchen with practiced steps. She put away the cereal, the soup cans, the milk. She washed a few dishes left from breakfast. The faucet dripped rhythmically into the stainless steel sink, each drop echoing in the quiet house. She hated that sound, but the plumber had quoted a fee she couldn't spare this month. Between her father's medication, the in-home nurse who came twice a week, and the mortgage on this smaller home, she could barely manage the basics. That was why she had taken the job at Ellery & Co. She hadn't wanted to start over again, not after the divorce, not after losing her old part-time counseling position when the clinic downsized. But steady pay was steady pay, and the role of executive assistant had been open. Demanding, yes, overwhelming at times, but it was something she could count on, something that anchored the financial chaos of her life. She poured herself a cup of tea, watching the steam rise and curl toward the ceiling. She leaned against the counter, letting the warmth seep into her hands. Her mind drifted to the office again, the shattered frame, the way he braced himself on the doorframe, the flicker of something like apology in his eyes. She had promised herself she wouldn't get pulled into someone else's emotional gravity ever again. The last time she let that happen, the marriage had nearly swallowed her whole. She had spent years trying to hold everything together, his frustrations, his depression, his resentment, while ignoring her own unraveling. When she finally left, she had sworn that she would keep a clean line between her heart and anyone else's storm. But tonight, seeing someone else fighting their own war in the dark, alone, it stirred something she didn't want stirred. She turned off the kitchen light and stepped quietly back to the living room. Her father had dozed off again, his breathing slow and uneven. She pulled the quilt higher on his lap and pressed a soft kiss to his forehead. He didn't wake. Maybe it was better that way. She moved through the house, checking locks, switching off unnecessary lights, setting the alarm. Everywhere she looked, she saw the evidence of two lives pressed into one space, her work bag beside his walker, her sneakers next to his orthopedic shoes, pill bottles near the fruit bowl. It was a delicate balance, always on the verge of tipping. When she finally slipped into her bedroom and sat on the edge of the bed, exhaustion washed over her. She let out a long breath, letting the day fall from her shoulders in slow, uneven pieces. The silence felt too loud. She leaned forward, elbows on her knees, letting her hair fall around her face like a curtain. She wondered, not for the first time, how long she could keep all of this together, how long she could tend to her father, pay the bills, survive the long hours at a company that demanded everything, and still somehow guard her heart from the pull of someone else's pain. Her thoughts drifted back to Mark, to that look in his eyes when he realized he wasn't alone, to the question she didn't dare say out loud. How could she stabilize her own life when the man she worked for seemed ready to fall apart at any moment? The answer didn't come. Only the soft hum of the heater filled the room, warm and lonely in the dark. Mark acted as if the night before had never happened. When Claire stepped into the office the next morning, the lights were already on in his corner suite. His door was ajar, just enough for her to see him seated behind his desk, posture rigid, eyes fixed on the laptop screen. A mug of coffee sat untouched beside a stack of reports, thin steam long gone. The air felt heavy, as if whatever had broken inside that room last night had been carefully swept out of sight, but not fully gone. She paused for a moment, taking in the scene before pushing the door wider. He didn't look up. His fingers tapped mechanically against the keyboard, deliberate and controlled in a way that made her uneasy. The sharp clatter of the keys reminded her of the objects falling the night before, except this sound was tighter, almost brittle. "Good morning, Mr. Ellery," she said softly. "Morning." The word left him clipped, as if he had rehearsed removing all softness from it. Claire walked to her desk outside his office, setting down her bag. She removed her coat, smoothed her blouse, and sat down, trying to settle her mind into work mode. The building buzzed with the low hum of printers, distant conversations, the elevator dinging somewhere down the hall, familiar sounds, safe sounds. But underneath it all, the memory of last night scraped at her thoughts, refusing to fade. She opened her calendar, reviewed the tasks for the morning, and prepared the documents he needed. She didn't intend to mention anything about the night before. Whatever she had witnessed wasn't hers to bring up, and judging by his rigid posture, he clearly wasn't planning to acknowledge it either. When she stepped back into his office a few minutes later, she found him exactly as before. No movement, no shift in expression, only the faint tightening around his eyes betrayed anything human. "I have the updated project reports and your schedule for today," she said. This time he did look up, just for a second. His gaze brushed over her before retreating, as though making eye contact posed some sort of risk. "Leave them on the desk," he said. His voice didn't tremble, but something beneath it felt fragile, like a thin layer of ice covering deeper water. She placed the reports gently next to his notebook. As she did, she noticed his jaw clench subtly, the muscle beneath the skin pulling tight. His right hand, resting near the edge of the desk, showed a faint tremor. He tucked it into his lap quickly, but not quickly enough. Claire stepped back a little. She kept her expression neutral, the way she did around her father on his more difficult mornings. Calm, unintrusive, nothing that might feel like a confrontation. He cleared his throat. "I'll review those later." "Of course," she replied. The silence that followed wasn't comfortable. It wasn't even neutral. It was a silence that had weight, a silence full of things neither wanted to admit they had seen. Claire adjusted the strap of her watch, willing her hands to remain steady. She turned to leave, stepping carefully so her heels wouldn't click too loudly against the polished floor. As she reached the doorway, he spoke again. "I trust everything is set for the 9 o'clock meeting." "Yes," she said. "Conference room, B. Your presentation notes are printed and ready." He nodded, but didn't lift his eyes from the papers. His detachment wasn't rude, it was self-protective, like a man trying to rebuild a wall that had cracked. She recognized that instinct. It was the same one she felt after her marriage ended, when she went weeks speaking only when necessary, because any real word felt too vulnerable. A few hours passed with little interaction. Whenever she stepped into his office, he kept his tone short, professional, and cool. Not once did he allow himself a glance too long or a breath too deep. If she hadn't seen the shattered photo frame the night before, she might have believed the facade. But she had seen it. She had heard the way his breath had broken. And now she saw the way he meticulously hid every sign of it. Late in the morning, she brought him the updated schedule for the following week. She approached slowly, aware of the tension humming from him like a low electrical current. He was reviewing a spreadsheet, glasses perched on the bridge of his nose, shoulders drawn upward in a stiff line. "I finished adjusting the week's appointments," she said, placing the printed schedule on his desk. He reached for it and flinched. It was slight, barely more than a twitch of his fingers. But Claire caught it. His hand pulled back for a fraction of a second before forcing itself forward again. The movement was involuntary, instinctive, the kind someone made when they expected to be hurt or exposed. Her breath paused. She didn't react physically, but inside, something sank an ache for him, for the private war he was clearly fighting. A man like him shouldn't have had to brace himself over a simple piece of paper, but he did. And that small, fragile flinch said more about his state than anything else. He cleared his throat softly, pretending nothing had happened. "Thank you," he said, his voice low. She nodded. "If you need adjustments, just let me know." He didn't answer. His eyes stayed fixed on the schedule, though she doubted he was actually reading it. Back at her own desk, Claire sat down slowly, letting the moment settle. She tried to focus on her computer screen, on the endless list of tasks waiting for her, but her mind kept circling back to the same question. It was the same one that had followed her from the office last night, the same one that lingered now in the quiet hum of the workday. What had happened in Mark Ellery's life to leave cracks so deep he couldn't hide them anymore, yet still tried to? The moment she touched his calendar, everything went wrong. Claire hadn't planned to adjust anything, not at first. She simply opened the digital schedule to check the morning meetings. But the screen glowed with back-to-back obligations. Blocks of color stacked so tightly they looked like a wall closing in. Names, deadlines, conference calls. No break between them. No space to breathe. It was the kind of calendar built for a machine, not a man who had barely held himself together 12 hours earlier. She hovered her hand over the trackpad. Just a small change, she told herself. A few adjustments to ease the pressure. A 20-minute buffer mid-morning, another gap between the lunch meeting and the client call. Nothing drastic, nothing that would harm the company. Just room, a little room. Her breathing steadied as she worked. She reassigned one meeting to Thursday, pushed a financial review into next week, cleared a sliver of time that might allow him to step outside or even just sit without bracing himself. When she finished, the calendar looked less like a battlefield. She exhaled softly, almost relieved. Then the office door behind her opened. She didn't hear him enter. She only felt it, the sudden shift in the air, the way the room tightened around him. She looked up, startled, as Mark stepped toward her with a hard, determined pace. His eyes locked onto the monitor before he even met her gaze. "What are you doing?" His voice wasn't loud, but it carried the sharpness of a blade drawn too quickly. Claire straightened in her chair. "I adjusted your schedule slightly. I noticed how full the next few days were. And you changed my calendar." The volume rose, not from anger alone, but from something raw. A flash of panic flickered in his eyes before he masked it with a hard stare. "Without asking me?" She stood up slowly. "I only moved a few things. You had no breaks today. I thought it might help." "You're not here to think," he snapped. "You're here to manage tasks, not to rearrange my life." The words hit her like a cold slap. Her throat tightened. She could hear echoes of an old argument in his tone, a voice from her past telling her she'd crossed a line she never knew existed. Her heart thudded painfully against her ribs. She hated this feeling, this shrinking sensation, as though someone were pulling the rug out from under her feet. "I wasn't trying to overstep," she said quietly. "Then what would you call it?" His jaw clenched. "You don't understand the implications of shifting those meetings. You don't know what I'm managing." She felt her hands tremble slightly but kept them tucked at her sides. "I figured a bit of space might help you handle everything more clearly. Yesterday seemed—" She stopped herself, realizing she was treading on dangerous ground. Seemed what he demanded. Her eyes flicked briefly to his. A long second passed between them, too still, too charged. Through the glass walls of the office, the rest of the floor moved with the calm quiet of a normal workday. Phones rang softly, printers hummed. Somewhere, someone laughed faintly. But in here, everything felt suspended. "It looked like you needed space yesterday," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The words hung there, honest and gentle. Yet the effect was instant and startling. He froze, not visibly, not dramatically, but enough that she saw the shift. His shoulders stiffened, his breath faltered. His eyes widened just a fraction, as though someone had thrown open a door he'd been holding shut with his entire body. The moment stretched thin, heavy with unspoken memory. Claire felt her own breath catch. She hadn't meant to cut that close. She only meant to offer understanding, a small recognition of the strain she'd witnessed. But she could see it now, the strike of her words landing exactly where he was most unguarded. His mouth opened slightly, then closed again. His coat sleeve brushed the corner of the desk as he stepped back, the sound oddly loud in the stillness. For the first time since she'd met him, he looked unsure of what to say. "Don't," he said softly, almost pleading. "Don't make assumptions about things you don't understand." "I wasn't assuming," she replied gently, "only noticing." The muscle in his throat tightened as he swallowed hard. For a moment, he looked like he might say more, like he might finally let something slip through the walls he held so rigidly. But then he straightened, forcing his posture into that cold, controlled frame she had seen all morning. "Undo the changes," he said. "I need the schedule as it was." She nodded. "I'll fix it." He turned away but paused at the door, his hand resting on the frame just long enough for her to see the faint tremor again. Then he left without another word, leaving behind the scent of his cologne and a silence that settled over her like a heavy blanket. Claire sat down slowly, her heartbeat still too fast. She rubbed her palms against her skirt, grounding herself. She hated moments like this, Moments that pulled old fears to the surface. Reminders of the years she spent being told she was too much, too little, too careful, too careless. She closed her eyes as she reopened the calendar, undoing each adjustment she had made. Her chest ached with something she couldn't name. Why had such a simple sentence, once spoken without judgment, struck him so deeply as she worked? Her thoughts wouldn't settle. She replayed his expression, the fleeting fear she'd caught before he buried it, the way he recoiled, as though her words had pressed on an invisible bruise. Her fingers hovered above the keyboard. What kind of pain made a man react like that? The question lingered long after she returned his calendar to its crowded, suffocating state. By the time she got home, her knees felt like they belonged to someone 20 years older. The porch light cast a dull circle on the wooden steps, catching the faint trails of melting frost. Claire paused there for a moment, one hand gripping the railing as she steadied her breath. The cold seeped through her coat, but she barely noticed it. What she felt most was the deep ache running from her shoulders down her spine, the kind that came from long days carrying invisible weight. Inside, the living room was dim, except for the soft glow of the TV. A muted nature documentary flickered across the screen, the sound barely above a whisper. Her father sat slumped in his recliner, chin resting against his chest, breath uneven but steady. The quilt, the one her mother had pieced together out of old shirts and fabric scraps, had slipped to the floor. Claire bent slowly to pick it up, her fingers brushing against the worn stitching. "Dad," she whispered. He didn't stir. She wasn't sure whether that was a blessing or another small sign of decline. Either way, she placed the quilt gently over his knees and sank down onto the floor. The carpet felt rough beneath her palms as she leaned back against the recliner, letting her head rest against the cushion near his elbow. The quiet pressed in on her, not peaceful quiet. The other kind, the heavy, hollow silence that came after a day of trying too hard and giving too much. She pulled her knees to her chest and wrapped her arms around them. Her breaths came slow, shaky. All day she had held herself upright, trying to be professional, steady, composed. Now, in the muted light of her living room, she felt every inch of the strain she had tried to ignore. Her father's medicine bottles lined the side table. The labels stared back at her, a reminder of routines she couldn't afford to slip on. A reminder that tomorrow morning she'd have to wake him, coax him into eating breakfast, hand him the right pills at the right hour, answer his questions with patience even when he repeated himself 4 times in a row. Her gaze drifted to the bills stacked on the bookshelf. She hadn't opened the new envelope from the clinic yet. She knew what it would say: another increase, another expense she wasn't sure she could cover. She rubbed her forehead, feeling the beginnings of a headache pulsing behind her eyes. She wondered, not for the first time, if she should quit the job, not because she wanted to. The work, though demanding, gave her a sense of purpose, a place to belong outside of this house, but because every day felt like a tightrope walk. If her father's condition worsened even slightly, she didn't know how she would keep up. She couldn't afford in-home care 5 days a week. She couldn't afford to lose the income either. Responsibility tugged at her from one side, survival tugged from the other, and caught somewhere between them was her dignity, the part of her that wanted to believe she was still capable, still strong, not failing at everything she tried to hold together. She lowered her forehead to her knees, letting her eyes close. The carpet smelled faintly of pine cleaner. The hum of the refrigerator drifted in from the kitchen. She felt tears prickling, hot and embarrassing, but she didn't wipe them away. It wasn't often she let herself break, even a little. "What am I going to do?" she whispered into the quiet. The question hung there, unanswered. A moment later, the recliner creaked softly. Claire froze. She didn't move until she heard her father's breath catch in a startled gasp. "Emily!" His voice trembled, thick with confusion. She lifted her head, wiping quickly at her cheeks before standing. "Dad, it's me," she said gently. "It's Claire." He blinked up at her, his eyes clouded with that familiar, heartbreaking fog. "Emily, you're back early." She swallowed the sting. "No, Dad, I'm Claire, your daughter." His brows pulled together. He looked at her longer this time, as if his mind were sorting through old memory boxes, searching for the right name. Claire, he finally murmured, though she wasn't sure if he truly remembered or was simply repeating what she told him. He shifted in the recliner, rubbing his forehead. I must have dozed off. You did. She adjusted the quilt again, smoothing it with quiet hands. You're okay? You look tired, he said. His voice held a softness that reminded her of her childhood, before the illness had started taking pieces of him. Long day at work, she nodded. Yeah, long day. He studied her with an expression that flickered between clarity and confusion. You should rest, he said. Don't push yourself too hard. Her throat tightened. I'll be fine, she whispered. You don't have to worry. He closed his eyes again, sinking back into the chair. Within a minute, he had drifted into a light sleep, his breaths evening out. Claire stood there watching him, the quiet spreading across the room like a blanket. She moved to the kitchen, filled a glass of water, and leaned against the counter. The house felt too still again, too small to hold everything she was feeling. She pressed her hand to her chest, trying to slow the ache gathering there. Could she really manage all of this, the long hours, the emotional landmines at work, the unpredictability at home? Could she keep Mark's volatile temperament from pulling her back into patterns she had sworn she'd never relive? Could she care for her father without losing pieces of herself along the way? The thought twisted inside her. What if she wasn't enough for all of it? What if everything she was trying so hard to hold together finally slipped through her fingers? She turned off the kitchen light, standing alone in the dark with only her breathing and the faint murmur of the TV to break the silence. And for the first time since starting the job, she wondered whether her life was about to unravel in ways she couldn't control. Mark wasn't supposed to overhear that phone call. Claire had stepped into the far end of the hallway, where the windows overlooked the city, hoping the distance would buy her a sliver of privacy. Morning light spilled through the glass in muted gold, washing over the quiet corridor. She stood in the corner, one hand pressed to her forehead, the other gripping her phone as though holding it tightly could steady her shaking breath. Yes, she whispered. I understand. Just tell me what the next step is. Her voice carried a kind of restraint that only people familiar with grief could recognize. Not panic, not shock, something deeper, something tired. Mark had walked out of his office to review a contract with the legal team. He hadn't intended to stop, but he froze the moment her words reached him, floating through the hallway like a small, cracked note. We can't increase his medication without Dr. Benson's approval, I see. No, he didn't sleep last night. At least, not well. He shouldn't have listened. He knew that. But his feet didn't move, as if the sound anchored him. Claire turned slightly, her profile visible against the window. Her shoulders trembled once small, controlled, but unmistakable. She rubbed her temple, eyes closing tightly as the nurse on the other end continued speaking. Whatever news she was receiving wasn't good. When she finally lowered the phone, she leaned her back against the wall. For a long moment, she didn't move. She just breathed, long and uneven, as though trying to hold herself together with the thin thread of a single exhale. Mark stood just out of sight, his hand resting against the doorway of the conference room. Something in his chest tightened painfully, a memory he didn't want rising too quickly. He recognized that trembling, the quiet collapse someone tried to hide because they didn't have the luxury to fall apart. Before he could stop himself, he stepped forward. Claire. She startled. Her head jerked up, eyes widening when she saw him. She straightened immediately, pulling her composure around her like a coat. Mr. Ellery, I didn't know you were there. He nodded once, keeping his expression carefully neutral, but his gaze lingered on her face, on the redness gathering around her eyes, the way she swallowed hard before meeting his eyes fully. Is everything all right? He asked. The question hung between them in a way that didn't feel formal. She opened her mouth to answer, then closed it again, uncertain. This wasn't a conversation meant for a workplace hallway. This wasn't something she owed him. It's just, my father, she said finally, her voice low. He's not doing well today. He waited, not pressing, not demanding, just standing there, quieter than she'd ever seen him. "He has Alzheimer's," she added. "Some days are harder. Today's one of them." A muscle tightened in Mark's jaw, but not with anger. This time it was something closer to recognition. He couldn't help the way his eyes softened, a shift so subtle that anyone else might have missed it. But Claire didn't. "I'm sorry," he said. Two simple words, but spoken with a sincerity she hadn't expected from him. "It's fine," she murmured, though they both knew it wasn't. She took a slow breath, tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear. "I'll get back to the reports for the afternoon meeting." She moved to walk past him, needing the motion, the task, something to pull her back into steadiness. But he stepped slightly aside rather than letting her rush off, not blocking her, just giving her pause. "Claire?" She looked up again, surprised by the gentleness in his tone. "Take an hour if you need it." The words hit her harder than she expected, not because he was offering time a simple enough gesture, but because of the way he said it, soft, careful, as if he understood how close she was to unraveling and didn't want to push her over the edge. Her breath caught. "I don't want to fall behind," she said, even though her voice wavered. "You won't," he replied. "I'll manage." It was the first time he had ever said something like that, the first moment he spoke not as her superior, but as a person who saw her pain and couldn't turn away from it. For a man so guarded, so fiercely self-contained, the tenderness shocked her more than any outburst could have. She nodded slowly, unsure what else to say. "Thank you." For a second, they simply stood there, the quiet of the hallway pressing around them like a gentle cocoon. He didn't reach for her. He didn't invade her space. But something in his eyes told her that, whatever distance had existed between them, yesterday wasn't quite the same today. Claire walked away first, heading toward the break room to gather herself. Mark watched her go, his chest tight in a way he couldn't name. He turned back toward his office, but stopped halfway. One hand pressed to the cool glass of the wall beside him. Her struggle stirred something old in him, something he thought he had buried beneath years of silence and work and grief he refused to face. He didn't want to examine it yet. He didn't want to give that feeling a name. But as he stood there, listening to her footsteps fade down the hallway, he knew this moment had shifted something in him. Something he wasn't ready for. Something he couldn't ignore. Of the long conference table, discussing quarterly projections with his usual precision. The next, his hand tightened around the edge of the polished wood, as though he needed it to stay upright. The color drained from his face so quickly that Claire, seated near the door, felt her stomach drop. She noticed first, not because she was watching him, but because she had learned the small signs over the past weeks. The stiffening of his shoulders, the way his eyes lost focus, not drifting, disconnecting. His palm pressed briefly to his chest, as if testing whether his heart still remembered how to beat normally. "Mr. Ellery," one of the directors asked, oblivious. Mark didn't respond. His breathing stuttered, shallow and sharp. His other hand gripped the table now. Papers shifted under his fingers. Claire stood slowly, trying not to draw attention. "Sir," she said quietly, hoping he would hear her voice before anyone else noticed. The director spoke again. "Mark, should we—" But before he could finish, Claire moved. She walked to Mark's side in a way that looked like routine assistance, calm, respectful, professional, only she felt her pulse spike. When she reached him, she gentled her voice, leaning just close enough. "Let's step out for a moment." His jaw clenched, breath catching as though he couldn't draw air fully into his lungs. He didn't protest when she touched his sleeve, just enough pressure to guide, not enough to embarrass. She led him out of the conference room, keeping her body angled to shield him from the dozen curious eyes behind them. The door closed, and the hallway swallowed them in quiet. His hand came up immediately, bracing against the wall. Claire placed her own hand near his elbow, close but not touching now, giving him room to panic without feeling trapped. "Mark," she said softly, "look at me." He tried. His eyes flicked up, unfocused. His breathing was too fast, too shallow, the kind that could spiral into something worse if he didn't break the pattern. "Try to breathe with me," she urged. She kept her voice low and steady. In, slow, and out. It took a moment before he followed. He hated this. She could see it in the taut lines around his mouth. He loathed being seen like this, but he kept his gaze near hers. Enough to try. In, she whispered, breathing with him, and out. After several breaths, the tremor in his hands eased, but only slightly. His shoulders still shook. He closed his eyes, forehead nearly touching the wall. It was the reminder. He murmured, his voice barely existed. The keynote. They scheduled it for the same week. She waited. It wasn't her place to push, but she also knew instinctively that if she said nothing, he might shut down again. The same week as what she asked gently. Silence stretched, filled only by his uneven breaths. For a moment she thought he wouldn't answer. Then his hand slipped from the wall. He pressed his fingers to his eyes, as if the pressure could hold the emotion in place. My wife, he said. Her accident. 5 years ago, next Tuesday. Claire's breath caught. Not from surprise, a man with his kind of grief was easy to spot if you knew how to look, but from the quiet devastation threaded through his voice, as if the words were rusted shut and speaking them scraped something raw inside him. I'm sorry, she whispered. He shook his head. I haven't talked about her in years. His voice wasn't angry or sharp. It was frightened, exposed, as if he had opened a door he'd kept locked so long he no longer remembered how to close it. She didn't reach out. She didn't tell him everything would be fine. People in deep grief rarely needed comfort wrapped in platitudes. They needed presence, a steady place to land. For a few long seconds, neither of them moved. The hallway, usually bustling during working hours, was empty now, unlucky timing for him. Lucky timing for the part of him that needed quiet. He leaned his back against the wall, finally letting his head rest there. His eyes were red again, though not from anger this time. Claire stood a few feet away, giving him space but not distance. She knew that balance intimately, the art of being near without intruding. I thought I was past this, he said hoarsely. It's been 5 years. Grief doesn't follow a calendar, she replied. He gave a humorless breath that was almost a laugh. No. I suppose it doesn't. She watched him try to steady himself, saw the tension in his chest loosen by degrees. He wasn't fine, but he wasn't spiraling anymore. If you want, she said quietly, I can move the keynote. Put it later in the month. His gaze snapped to hers for the first time since they stepped into the hallway. Not angry. Something else. Something like gratitude or fear of needing gratitude. Claire, he said, voice rough. I don't want anyone to know. I won't tell anyone, she answered. The promise left her lips without hesitation. He nodded once, a heavy acknowledgement of trust he hadn't meant to give, but somehow had. When she stepped back to give him room, his eyes followed her movement not suspiciously, but with a kind of weary awareness, as though he realized something had shifted between them, and he wasn't sure if he could allow it. He pushed off the wall slowly. I need a few minutes, he muttered. She began to walk away, giving him the solitude he asked for, but after a few steps, she paused at the corner. She turned back. Mark, she said softly. He lifted his head. If you ever need to step out again, just signal me. I'll handle the room. He didn't answer immediately. The hallway felt too still. Then he nodded, not stiffly, not with the formality he usually hid behind, but with something closer to surrender. As Claire walked away, she felt the weight of the moment settle on her shoulders. Not burden connection, unexpected, fragile connection. Behind her, Mark stayed where he was, staring at the pattern of light on the floor, trying to understand why letting her help hadn't felt like weakness at all. But the question lingered in him, sharp and unsettling. Would this moment draw them closer, or force him to shut himself away again? He asked her to stay a few minutes after 5, not for work. The sentence landed quietly, almost too quietly. When most staff were already packing up, Claire stood by his doorway holding her bag, the office humming with the soft end-of-day stillness. Through the tall windows, fading daylight stretched long shadows across his desk, softening the hard lines of the room. She hesitated. She wasn't used to men wanting things from her without the shield of professionalism. Not after her marriage, not after the years she'd spent caring for her father, with no space for anything else. But Mark didn't look demanding. He looked unsure. "If you have to get home, it's fine," he added quickly, gaze dropping to the papers he wasn't really reading. She surprised herself by saying, "I can stay a little while." He nodded, almost relieved, and motioned to the chair across from him. She sat, her bag resting beside her feet, hands folded loosely in her lap. The room felt softer than usual, the sharp daytime energy replaced by something slower, more human. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Mark said, "I owe you an apology for earlier this week." She knew which moment he meant. "You don't owe me anything, sir." He shook his head. "I do." His voice held none of its usual authority. "I shouldn't have spoken to you the way I did." She nodded once, accepting, not pushing. He seemed grateful for that. They talked at first about small, harmless things, the rain coming in overnight, the broken coffee machine on the 10th floor, the endless construction noise outside the building, ordinary topics, easy territory. But then Mark paused, his fingers tracing the rim of the glass of water beside him. "My wife," he said, voice low, used to complain about that same noise. She said the city never gave a man a chance to think. Claire looked up, surprised by the shift. He rarely spoke of her, even when he mentioned the accident earlier that week. Now, something in the quiet room seemed to let him try. "What was she like?" Claire asked gently. He exhaled, a slow, cautious release. She had a way of filling a room without trying. Everyone liked her. She laughed easily. A faint crease formed at the corner of his mouth, not quite a smile, but close. She used to tease me for being too serious. Claire could picture it, a woman warm and bright, balancing his intensity. He didn't talk long, but the few words he shared carried weight, pulled from a place he rarely touched. There was silence again, the kind that didn't need fixing. Claire rested her palms on her knees, thumb rubbing against the stitching of her slacks. "My father used to tell stories about his fishing trips," she said quietly. "The same ones, over and over. Lately he's been mixing the details up. Sometimes he forgets the endings." She swallowed. "Sometimes he forgets I've heard them my whole life." Mark looked at her with an attentiveness she wasn't used to receiving. "That must be hard." "It is." Her voice softened. "But I tell myself, the stories matter more than the accuracy." He nodded slowly, as if that meant more to him than she realized. The room shifted then, not in sound, but in feeling. A warmth settled between them, tentative but steady. She could feel it in the way he leaned slightly forward, in the way her shoulders relaxed for the first time that day. Something fragile, unspoken, hovered in the air. She didn't know what to do with it. He didn't either. Mark reached for the small photo frame he kept half hidden beside his desk. He turned it toward himself, not toward her. "I keep thinking I should put this away," he murmured, "but I can't." Claire didn't step closer. She let him hold the moment without interruption. The fading light caught the glass of the frame, reflecting a soft glow across his fingers. "I'm sure she loved you," Claire said. His breathing hitched, not painfully, but unexpectedly, as if the words nudged something deep inside him. He set the frame down gently, aligning it with the edge of a paper out of habit. "Some days, I'm not sure what to do with all the things she left behind," he said. "The memories feel too heavy, but letting them fade feels like betrayal." Her eyes softened. She understood the tug-of-war more intimately than she wished. "Grief changes shape," she said, "but it doesn't disappear." He looked at her, then really looked, not at his employee, not at a woman 2 decades younger. He looked at someone who understood loss, someone whose own life had been carved by love and responsibility and long nights she didn't talk about. The air between them grew thicker, gentler. "Claire," he said quietly. "Yes, it's easier to breathe when you're around." The words fell so simply, so honestly, that they stole the breath from her lungs. There was no smooth delivery, no intention to impress, just a truth he hadn't meant to speak aloud. Her fingers tightened around the hem of her jacket. She felt the warmth rise in her chest, a mixture of tenderness and confusion, and something that made her heartbeat stumble. She didn't know what to say. She didn't even know what she was allowed to say. Mark looked down immediately, as if realizing the weight of what he'd revealed. He cleared his throat, though the sound didn't break the tension, it only deepened the uncertainty. Outside the office, the building lights flickered on, casting a faint glow along the hallway. The city beyond the windows shifted from gold to blue to deeper gray. Claire stood slowly, needing the motion to ground herself. "I should go check on my father," she murmured. Mark nodded, still avoiding her gaze, but his expression wasn't cold. It was vulnerable in a way she hadn't seen before. She moved toward the door, each step careful. When she reached the threshold, she paused, not sure why, and looked back. He was watching her now, quietly, as though waiting for something he didn't have the courage to ask. Her heart tightened. How was she supposed to respond to a sentence like that? She only meant to leave a file, not to find a piece of his soul. Claire stepped quietly into Mark's office just after lunch. The building unusually still, as most staff lingered downstairs for a catered event. His door, usually shut, sat slightly ajar. She knocked once, softly. No answer. She pushed it open another inch. "Mark," she called gently. Silence. She entered just far enough to place the quarterly report on the corner of his desk. The blinds were half closed, slats drawing lines of pale light across the room. A faint draft carried the scent of paper and cedar, the same scent that always lingered on his suits. She set the folder down. That's when she saw it. A single sheet of stationery lay near the edge of his desk, folded but slightly open as if abandoned in a rush. The paper was thick, the ink dark, the edges smudged in two places likely touched by hands that trembled. She didn't mean to read it, but a name at the top caught her eye. Anna, his wife. Her breath hitched, not from curiosity, from the unexpected intimacy of seeing her name written in his handwriting, the strokes heavier than usual, as though each letter had been pulled from somewhere deep. She didn't read further. She didn't dare. Instinctively, gently, she reached out to close the fold. Before she could, footsteps sounded behind her. Mark walked in. At first, his expression showed only surprise, but when his gaze dropped to her hand, hovering above the letter, something inside him hardened instantly. A wall, a shutter slamming down. "What are you doing?" he asked, his voice unfamiliar, tight, cold. She pulled her hand back as if burned. I just came to leave the report. I saw the letter by accident." His jaw locked. "Accident. Yes," she said quickly. "I didn't read it. Mark." He moved forward, grabbing the letter with a force that made the paper crinkle sharply. His eyes flared with a hurt so raw she felt it like a slap. Even though she knew it wasn't aimed at her. Not really. It came from somewhere older, deeper, buried for years. "You had no right," he said. The words pierced her more than his raised voice ever had. Not because of the accusation, but because she recognized the tone. It was the same tone her ex-husband had used when he blamed her for things she never did. It was the same tone her father sometimes fell into when confusion overtook memory. A tone that made her shrink despite herself. "I wasn't trying to invade anything," she whispered. You went through my personal things." The sharp edge in his voice cut through the quiet room. "You had to look." She shook her head quickly. "I didn't." He stepped back, gripping the letter as though shielding it from the world. His breathing tightened, anger mixing with panic, a dangerous combination she had already seen in him once before. "You don't get to touch this," he said, softer but more wounded. "You don't get to decide when I share something about her." Claire felt her own throat burn. I know. I wasn't. You think because I talked to you the other night that you are owed more. The accusation froze her. Her pulse stumbled. I never thought that, she said, voice cracking. I never asked you to talk about anything. You chose to. Her words only made his shoulders tense further. Pain flickered across his face. Not blame, not anger, but grief. The kind that lashes out at the nearest person because it has nowhere else to go. He turned away from her, pressing a hand to the back of his neck. I can't do this, he muttered. Not with you standing here, not with you looking at things that aren't yours to see. Claire took a slow breath, steadying herself. She didn't cry easily, but this moment cut at an old wound she thought she had bandaged years ago, the wound of being misunderstood, accused, blamed for simply being present. I shouldn't have walked in without waiting, she said quietly. But I didn't snoop. I just saw the paper sitting open. I didn't mean to hurt you. Her voice was soft, low, full of sincerity, but Mark didn't turn around. She watched his shoulders rise and fall, sharp breaths breaking in his chest. The way he held the letter against his side, fingers clenched too tightly, told her everything she needed to know. This wasn't about her. This was about the fear of losing the last pieces of someone he still loved. But the truth didn't soften the sting. I think I should give you some space, she said, whisper thin. He didn't answer. She stepped toward the door, her hand brushing the frame to steady herself. She felt the sting behind her eyes not from the accusation itself, but from how quickly warmth had turned to coldness, how fragile their connection had been, how easily broken. Before she stepped out, she looked once more toward him. He still faced away, shoulders rigid, grief twisting his posture into something that looked almost painful. Mark, she said softly. He didn't move. She swallowed, letting the unspoken words fall back into her chest. Words like, I understand, or you don't have to fight me, or you're not alone. Words that didn't belong in this room right now. Instead, she whispered, take care. Then she left, closing the door behind her with a quiet click. In the hallway, she stood still, breathing slowly through the ache tightening around her ribs. She fought the instinct to run, the instinct to defend herself, the instinct to go back and explain again, to fix something that felt irreparably cracked. But some fractures didn't heal through words, not immediately. Not today. She took a few steps down the hall, her shoes echoing faintly on the polished floor. Each step felt heavy, uncertain. Was this the end of whatever fragile understanding they had begun to build? She didn't know, but the question followed her all the way to the elevator, settling like a weight she didn't yet know how to carry. The office felt colder without their quiet conversations. Not literally the thermostat still hummed the same low click, but in the way the building seemed to hold its breath. Claire noticed it the moment she stepped off the elevator. Light spilled across the open floor, bright and clean. Yet everything felt muted, as if someone had drawn a thin veil over the day. She walked to her desk and paused. Her coffee mug sat exactly where she'd left it yesterday morning, untouched. She wrapped her fingers around it out of habit, then let go before the motion could pull her into memory. She lowered her bag gently onto the chair, taking an extra second before sitting down. Since the confrontation in Mark's office, she had moved differently, quieter, smaller, as if her body was trying to avoid casting a shadow anywhere near him. She arrived on time, left on time, spoke only when necessary. She carried herself with the kind of careful politeness reserved for rooms where breakable things had once been dropped. Across the office, she heard his voice not loud, but sharp, controlled in a way that felt like it took effort. His footsteps passed by her desk twice that morning, each time brisk, his gaze fixed forward. He didn't look at her, not once, but she could feel the avoidance like a current in the air. She focused on her screen, typing slowly through emails. Her fingers shook once when she reached for the next task, so she withdrew her hand and breathed through it. The memory of his accusation still burned beneath her ribs, even though she had tried to reason with herself that he was grieving, that his anger hadn't really been about her. Still, the echo lingered. "You went through my personal things. You don't get to touch this." She blinked hard, pushing the words away. Down the hall, Mark stepped into his office and closed the door harder than needed. The sound made several employees glance up. Claire lowered her head again. She wasn't looking at him, yet she knew exactly what he looked like: shoulders tight, jaw locked, eyes tired, the weight of his guilt hidden beneath irritation. She didn't know that guilt was eating at him. She couldn't see the way he stared at the letter every night since, regretting how quickly he had turned on her, how the pain of memory had tangled with fear and lashed out before he could pull himself back. All she felt was the distance. The morning passed in uneasy quiet. At lunch, she sat alone in the small break room. She ate a sandwich she barely tasted while staring at the laminate tabletop. When footsteps approached, she stiffened for a brief moment, a reflex she hated, but couldn't help. It wasn't him. It was another assistant. Claire offered a polite smile, but her chest tightened with relief that she wished she didn't need. By mid-afternoon, the atmosphere had grown heavier. People whispered more, laughed less. Mark spoke curtly in meetings, cutting sentences short, ending calls abruptly. His employees learned to keep their distance. Only Claire noticed the slight tremor in his voice during a call that should have been straightforward. Only she recognized the tension tightening his breathing whenever he walked past her desk, as if proximity set off a reminder he didn't want. She wondered if she had broken something inside him, or inside herself. The thought stung. By 4:30, her email box blurred. Her father's care had grown more complicated that week, and exhaustion pressed behind her eyes. But beneath it all, a deeper ache pulsed the sense of losing a connection she never fully understood, a connection she never meant to step into, yet had begun to rely on more than she realized. She stood, walked quietly down the hall, and paused outside HR. The door was half open. The HR director looked up from her desk. "Claire." "Everything all right?" Her fingers curled around the edge of the doorframe. The question shouldn't have hurt, but it did. "I just wanted to ask something." "Of course." Claire stepped inside. The room felt too bright, too open. She lowered her voice. "I wanted to know the process for submitting a resignation. Just generally." The director blinked. "Are you thinking of leaving? I'm not sure." Claire admitted the first honest thing she'd said in hours. "I just need to understand what the steps are." Something in her voice must have revealed more than she intended, because the director softened. "Well, it's simple. A written notice, usually 2 weeks. But if something's happened." "No," Claire said quickly, "nothing specific. I'm just weighing a few things." The director nodded, letting the conversation end gracefully. Claire thanked her and walked out, the hallway suddenly feeling longer than usual. Her steps echoed faintly. When she returned to her desk, she did not notice that Mark stood at the far end of the corridor. He hadn't meant to overhear anything, and he hadn't caught the words clearly, only saw her emerging from HR, her expression tight, her posture weary. Something inside him clenched, sharp and immediate. He turned away before she could see him, yet he couldn't shake the image. He walked back into his office, closing the door quietly this time, leaning his hands on the back of his chair. He didn't want to admit what the sight stirred in him. Claire sat at her desk, staring at her computer screen, but not seeing the words. Her hand hovered over her mouse, then fell to her lap. The resignation process played in her mind simple, straightforward, final. She imagined the empty chair she would leave behind, the quiet hallway, the closed office door she would no longer pass. She imagined his face when he learned she was gone, and she wondered, painfully, if leaving would hurt less than staying. The question sat heavy in her chest, refusing to move. Claire was halfway to the parking garage when she heard him call her name. The sound cut through the steady curtain of rain, startling her enough that she stopped mid-step. Water pooled around her shoes as she turned. Mark stood at the entrance to the garage, rain soaking into the shoulders of his jacket. He must have followed her straight out of the office. There was no umbrella, no coat, just the look of a man desperate not to let something slip away. "Claire," he said again, breath uneven. "Please, wait." She hesitated, fingers tightening around the straps of her bag. The garage lights glowed behind him in hazy gold, casting his figure into soft silhouette against the rain. The sight tugged painfully at her chest, not because he looked strong, but because, for the first time, he didn't. She didn't move closer, but she didn't leave either. He took a slow step toward her, shoes splashing through shallow puddles. "I shouldn't have spoken to you the way I did." Her eyes lowered, the memory still sharp. "You were upset. That doesn't excuse it." His voice cracked on the last word, barely audible beneath the rain. He swallowed, visibly struggling to steady himself. "Claire, I thought I assumed you read the letter." She breathed in slowly. "I didn't. I know that now." He dragged a hand through his wet hair, rain dripping from his fingers. "At the time, I panicked." That letter, it was the first time I tried to write to her in years. It felt... He stopped, searching for the right word. "Private," she offered softly. He shook his head. "More than private." It felt like the last piece of her I still had. And seeing someone near it, he exhaled in a shudder. It felt like losing her again. Claire took a small step closer, the rain cooling her skin, soaking into her sweater. She didn't interrupt. She let him speak something he wasn't good at, something he rarely allowed himself. He looked at her then. Really looked. His eyes weren't angry now. They were red-rimmed, tired, and achingly human. "I'm not good with grief," he said. "I hide it. I bury it. And when it breaks through, I react before I think." Claire wrapped her arms around herself, more to hold the moment together than to keep warm. "I understand," she murmured. "Grief makes people do things they don't mean." He took another step toward her, close enough now that she could see the rain trailing down the lines of his jaw. "You didn't deserve the things I said." A tightness in her chest loosened, but only slightly. "It hurt," she admitted. The words slipped out before she had the chance to soften them. He winced, but nodded. "I know." They stood in silence for a moment, rain filling the space between them with a soft hiss. "I never meant to invade your privacy," she said quietly. "I walked in to drop the report. The letter was sitting open. I didn't read it. Mark, I would never... I believe you." He stepped closer, voice strained. "I just didn't want anyone to see me that way. Not again, not exposed." Her eyes softened. "It's not weakness to grieve." He gave a faint, broken laugh. "It feels like it." "No," she said, shaking her head slightly. "It's proof that you love deeply, that you still do." He looked away, blinking hard. The rain slid from his eyelashes, disguising what might have been tears. She didn't press him, she simply waited. When he finally spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper. "I don't want you to leave." Claire stiffened, her breath catching in her throat. I'm not sure what you mean," he exhaled shakily. "I heard, or rather, I saw you coming out of HR today." He looked pained at the admission, as if he was embarrassed to confess it. "I didn't hear what you said, but it wasn't hard to guess." She looked down at the wet pavement. "I wasn't submitting anything. I just asked about the process." "That's enough," he murmured, his tone raw. "Enough to tell me you were thinking about it." She didn't respond. The silence itself was an answer. He stepped closer, slow enough to give her room to move away if she wished. She didn't. "Claire," he said, her name thick on his tongue, "this distance between us, it's my fault. And if I lose you as my assistant, I'll accept that. But if I lose whatever it is we've started, that's a different kind of loss. One I'm not ready for." She swallowed, rain sliding down her cheeks like tears she refused to let fall. "I don't know what this is," she whispered, "or what it's supposed to be." He nodded, the vulnerability in his eyes unmistakable. "I don't know how to do this." His voice trembled. But I don't want you to go. A breath caught in her throat. The words felt like a confession, not romantic, not rushed, but real, frighteningly real. She stared at him, the rain blurring the space between them, her heart beating in uneven pulses. She felt the tension of someone standing at a threshold, not sure whether to step through or turn away. The garage lights flickered softly behind them, casting golden halos on the wet ground. She held his gaze, searching for a truth she wasn't sure she wanted to see. What did this mean to him? What did it mean to her? The question pressed in on her chest, heavy and unresolved, as the rain continued to fall in thin silver lines around them. The next morning, something rare happened. He opened the blinds. Claire noticed the soft scrape of the roller as she walked into the office, the early sun pouring across his desk in gentle bands of gold. For a moment, she didn't move. She simply watched him stand there, one hand still resting on the cord, his face lit by a light he hadn't allowed in for years. He didn't look at her right away. His gaze stayed on the city below, washed in morning brightness. When he finally turned, his voice was lower than usual, almost careful. "Good morning, Claire," she nodded, setting her bag down. "Morning." Something quiet settled between them, not tension this time, but a space newly cleared, as if the air itself understood they were beginning again. He gestured toward the chairs near the window. "Do you have a minute?" She did, and she surprised herself by wanting to sit. She took the chair beside him, smoothing her skirt, grounding her breathing. Outside, the slow traffic folded itself through the streets, horns muted by distance. "I've been thinking about last night," he began, eyes fixed on the skyline, "and about everything leading up to it." Claire folded her hands in her lap, waiting. "I owe you clarity," he said, "and boundaries, real ones." She almost smiled, not because the words were ideal, but because they were honest. "That sounds fair." He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "I can't pretend I'm fine anymore. That's cost me too much, and you've seen me at my worst more times than anyone should see their boss in a lifetime." His jaw tightened, but this time, it wasn't with anger. "I'm starting therapy again. I called my old counselor this morning." Claire's breath softened, easing out of her. "That's good. Truly." "I should have done it years ago," he admitted. "But last night made it obvious that avoiding grief doesn't keep it from controlling me." She nodded slowly. "Avoiding anything eventually collapses on you. I know that too well." He turned then, studying her carefully. "You've been carrying too much, Claire. More than your job, more than I realized." A faint ache warmed her throat. "Life happens," she murmured, "and we adjust. You shouldn't have to shoulder everything," he said, "and I don't want to be another burden." She looked at him, taken aback by the sincerity in his tone. "You're not a burden," she said, but stopped before the rest slipped out. "You were just hurting." She wasn't ready to say that aloud. Not yet. He nodded, accepting the unfinished sentence for what it was. They talked quietly for a long moment, letting the morning light fill the pauses. Eventually, he cleared his throat. "I want to set expectations, boundaries, so you feel safe working here, and so I don't cross lines again." She shifted slightly in her chair. "I want the same. I think maybe we let things blur a bit." His lips tightened in agreement. "We did. I still want to do my job well," she added. "But I also have limits. My father's health. It's getting worse." He lowered his gaze, regret crossing his expression. "I heard enough on that call. I shouldn't have. But I did. And I know things are difficult. Some days are more difficult than others." She felt her voice wobble, but she steadied it. "I can't stay late every night, and I can't take on responsibilities outside my role. Not right now. You shouldn't have to." His reply came instantly firm, decisive. "We'll adjust your hours when needed, and I'll have someone else handle the overflow." He looked at her with something like apology. "I should have asked about your life before assuming I understood it." She let out a quiet breath, the kind that released more than one moment of tension. "Thank you." For the first time in weeks, the silence between them felt gentle, not weighted. He leaned back, stretching his legs out slightly, as if easing into a posture he'd avoided for years. "About us," he said quietly. Her pulse flickered. "I meant what I said," he continued. "I don't want you to go, but I also don't want to push you into something unclear. I'm not ready for anything more than honesty, and time, and respect." She absorbed each word like stepping stones placed carefully in front of her. "I'm not ready for anything fast," she said softly, "and I can't afford chaos. Not with my father's situation. Not with my life the way it is." "I wouldn't ask you for chaos," he murmured. She looked down at her hands, clasped tightly in her lap. "Then maybe, one day at a time. Not assuming too much, not promising too much." He tilted his head, watching her. "One day at a time," he repeated, voice almost reverent. "I can do that." She met his gaze. There was warmth there, fragile, new, but steady enough to hold for a moment. For the rest of the morning, the office felt different, softer, clearer. They spoke about workflow, communication, scheduling. She outlined boundaries, no personal tasks, no late-night demands unless critical. He accepted everyone. And as they talked, she noticed how the sunlight touched the edges of his expression, as if softening years of stubborn shadow. After lunch, she walked past his office and found him sitting with a small, leather-bound journal open on his desk. His hand hovered over the page, pen paused in midair. He didn't notice her watching. It wasn't the letter to his wife this time. It was something new, something beginning. He glanced up, startled but not ashamed. "Just writing," he said quietly. She nodded, offering a small, understanding smile before returning to her desk. The rest of the day moved calmly, almost gently, as if the storm that had nearly destroyed their connection had washed the air clean instead. By 5 o'clock, she shut down her computer with a softness she hadn't felt in weeks. As she gathered her things, she felt a presence in her doorway. She looked up. "I'll see you tomorrow," he asked. "Tomorrow," she said. But as she walked to the elevator, the question lingered inside her chest, quiet and trembling. Could two people with broken histories truly build something new? And if they could, what might it become? On a chilly Thursday? He asked if she had plans after work. Claire froze for a half second, her hand hovering above the stack of folders she'd been organizing. His voice had been gentle, not assuming, not expectant, just a question carried on the soft breath of late afternoon. "Plans," she repeated, as if she needed time to understand the word. He stood near her doorway, coat already on, scarf loose around his neck. The hallway lights cast a faint glow against the dark wool, making him look both composed and uncertain. "Just a walk," he said, "around the block, fresh air. I thought it might help us both end the week a bit lighter." For a moment. She only listened to the elevator hum down the hall. She had spent months tightening the boundaries around her life work. Home, caregiving, nothing extra, nothing unpredictable. And yet, something in his expression softened the walls she'd built. She reached for her coat. A walk sounds fine. Outside, the evening had settled early. The cold bit softly at their cheeks as they stepped onto the sidewalk, their breaths rising in small clouds. Storefronts were shutting down for the night, metal gates rolling down, lights flicking off, baristas stacking chairs inside a nearly empty cafe. The street held it in between, quiet, not yet late, no longer busy. They walked slowly, matching each other's pace without speaking at first. Mark kept his hands in his pockets, shoulders slightly hunched, as though the temperature reminded him he was human and not the immovable force people assumed him to be. Claire glanced toward a window where a couple inside a diner shared a slice of pie. "I used to come here with my dad," she murmured. Back when he still knew the difference between Thursday and Sunday." Mark paused in his step, then continued walking beside her. "Does he have good days still?" "Some," she said, "mostly mornings." Her voice thinned slightly. "By evening, he's tired, confused. I try not to blame him for that, But some days, she trailed off, pulling her coat tighter around her. You don't have to finish that sentence, he said softly. They crossed a street where the traffic light blinked red over an empty intersection. A wind brushed past them, carrying the faint scent of roasted chestnuts from a vendor packing up his cart. You mentioned therapy, she said after a moment. He let out a breath that fogged the air. I did. I had my first session yesterday. His tone held no pride, no shame, only reality. It felt overdue. Strange, but overdue. I'm glad you went, she replied. He nodded, eyes set ahead. It made me think about how much I've avoided, about how grief doesn't disappear just because I bury it under work. His voice lowered, quieter now. I think I've been trying to outrun my own life. She glanced at him, saw the tension in his jaw, the vulnerability tucked between the words he forced himself to speak. Running only exhausts you, she said gently. Eventually, you have to face whatever's chasing you. They reached a small park. Bare branches curled into the dusky sky like dark sketches drawn against fading blue. A bench sat under a lamppost, whose light flickered with a faint, unreliable pulse. Mark motioned toward it. Sit. Claire hesitated, then nodded. They sat with a respectful space between them, not far, but not yet close. The cold from the metal bench seeped through their coats, but neither moved away. When my wife was alive, Mark began slowly. She used to drag me out for walks just like this. On cold nights, said it kept the world from closing in. He gave a soft, uneven laugh. I didn't understand it then. And now, Claire asked. He looked at his hands. Now I understand too well. A silence stretched wide, but not empty. She stared at her breath drifting upward. I had dreams. You know, she said finally. Before everything with my father, before the divorce, before life felt like survival instead of living. He turned toward her, waiting. I wanted to go back to school. She continued, finish my degree, maybe teach, something simple, steady, but plans change. She pressed her gloves together, and I got used to putting myself last. The lamppost flickered again, casting a warm halo over her face. He watched the way her eyes softened, the way her shoulders loosened as though speaking truths she hadn't touched in a long time. You deserve more than survival. Claire, he said. She felt the words land inside her, unsettling something quiet and long forgotten. They rose from the bench and resumed walking. The night had deepened, and with it came a strange sense of ease, the kind that settled into the spaces between footsteps. They reached a corner where the sidewalk narrowed. As they stepped aside to let a couple pass, Claire's hand brushed against Mark's. Just a second, barely a moment, but the contact lingered like warmth in winter. Neither pulled away. He looked down at their hands, then at her. She didn't speak. She didn't move. She only let the moment exist. The streetlights hummed, the cold air pressed in gently around them, and for the first time in a long while, he felt something open instead of close. But as they continued walking side by side, a question settled between them, quiet, trembling, unfinished. Where did this lead? And were either of them brave enough to find out? They stood on opposite sides of her car, neither wanting to be the first to say goodnight. The parking lot was nearly empty, the evening cold settling gently over the quiet street, but the air between them felt warmer than the pool of light cast by the street lamp above. Claire rested one hand on the edge of her car door, not opening it yet, not ready for the moment to end. Mark kept his distance, his breath visible in thin puffs, his coat brushing softly in the breeze. For a long second, neither spoke. The walk they'd shared lingered around them, the soft talk, the small confessions, the way their hands had brushed and neither had moved away. None of it felt dramatic or rushed. It was something else entirely. Something steady, something careful, something they both, in their own ways, had been missing. It's late, Claire finally said, though her voice held no urgency. A little. Mark replied, his tone warmer than the night air. But a good kind of late. She smiled just enough for him to notice. The simple honesty in the way he looked at her made her shift slightly, nerves brushing the inside of her ribs. She hadn't let anyone stand this close to her life in years, not since before her father's illness. Not since before the divorce had carved a quiet ache into her days. And yet, here she was, not wanting to leave. "You didn't have to walk me out," she said gently. "I know," he answered. "I wanted to." She let the words settle. They didn't feel heavy. They didn't ask anything of her. They just were. A breeze blew between them, catching a loose strand of her hair. She tucked it behind her ear, aware of the way his eyes warmed as he watched her. "Today was nice," she said, and immediately felt the softness of the word, too small for what the evening had really meant. He nodded once, slow, as if he understood exactly what she meant anyway. "It was," he said, "more than I expected." She studied him for a moment, the man who had, not long ago, been cold and unreachable, all sharp edges and buried grief. Tonight he seemed different. Not lighter exactly, but less alone inside himself. "You don't have to explain anything," she said, her voice dipping lower. "About the past, about your wife, about the letter." He swallowed, his eyes lowering for a moment. "I know." His voice cracked just slightly before he steadied it. "But I might someday." Claire nodded, offering him the space he needed. He moved one step closer, not enough to close the distance completely, but enough that she felt the quiet intention behind it. "I just want to say," he paused, breath visible in the cold, "thank you for not giving up on me." The words reached her like a soft hand against her chest. She felt her throat tighten, a tenderness rising through her that she hadn't expected tonight. She was used to carrying people her father, her younger self, the weight of old promises she'd made and broken. She wasn't used to being thanked for simply staying. "I didn't stay for you," she said softly. "I stayed because something told me there was more to see, more to understand." She lifted her eyes to meet his. "You just had to let me." He held her gaze, something gentle and unfamiliar shining through the tired lines around his eyes. "I'm trying," he whispered. "I really am. I know." The silence that followed didn't feel awkward. It felt like a door gently opening just an inch, but enough to see the light inside. "So," he said after a moment, shifting his weight slightly, "would you like to do this again sometime?" Which part she asked with a faint smile. "The walking, the talking, the part where we pretend we're not freezing." He let out a softened laugh, one she hadn't heard from him before. "All of it," he admitted, "but slowly, only if you want to." She didn't answer right away. Her pulse fluttered at the idea, not fear, but something similar to it, something shaped like hope. "Slow is good," she finally said. "Slow is what I can do." He nodded, relief warming his expression. "Good." The parking lot grew quieter. A car passed in the distance, its headlights sweeping briefly over the pavement. The moment felt suspended, a quiet place between endings and beginnings. "Well," Claire murmured, fingers brushing the car door handle again. "I should get home." "My dad?" "Of course," he said gently. She opened the door halfway, then paused. A question flickered through her, a small, tender wondering. "Mark, yes." She hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "What you said earlier, about taking things one day at a time," her breath fogged in the air. "I think I can do that too." He exhaled, a soft warmth curling into the cold night. "Then maybe we're already further along than we think." She smiled, small but true. Then she stepped into the car, leaving the door open just a moment longer than she needed to. He stepped back, giving her space, yet not retreating fully. "Drive safe," he said, voice low. "I will." She closed the door gently. Through the window, their eyes met once more, quiet courage reflected in both. As she backed out of the parking space, He didn't turn away. He watched until her headlights disappeared around the corner, and she, gripping the wheel a little lighter than usual, felt something she hadn't felt in years, the sense that life could still open new doors, even after so much had been lost. What happens when two careful hearts choose courage over fear? Tonight, neither of them knew, but for the first time, the not knowing felt beautiful. Sometimes, healing begins in the small, quiet places we never thought to look. It doesn't always arrive with certainty or confidence. Sometimes it comes as a single, hesitant step towards someone who simply understands our ache. There's a gentle truth many of us learn. Later in life, brokenness doesn't make us unlovable, and grief doesn't mean our story is over. Two people who have lived long enough to know loss can still find something new, not by erasing what hurt them, but by learning to carry it with softer hands. And when someone shows up with patience instead of pressure, with presence instead of promises, it becomes easier to breathe again. Another truth is this: courage isn't loud. Often, it's the quiet decision to keep the door open just a little longer, to let someone see the parts we've hidden, or to let ourselves believe in a future that doesn't hurt as much as the past did. If you've ever felt the weight of starting over, I hope this reminds you even careful hearts can bloom again. And sometimes, all it takes is one honest moment of connection to remind us that we're still capable of hope. Thank you, truly, for spending a part of your day with this story. Your presence here matters more than you might realize. It's what keeps these gentle but human moments alive. If the story touched you in any way, a simple share or subscribe helps carry a little more kindness into the world. Wishing you calm evenings, warm light, and a heart that finds what it needs.